we will go from the clinics and what we get in the market to actually how do we go to the market. And there is one step in between for which Alexander Bernier, he's a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto and a lawyer. He will elucidate for us. And he, of course, has been involved in data governance tools for multiple biomedical research consortia. One of them was the EUCAN, so the Human Cell Atlas and European Canadian Cancer Network. He has been chair of the COVID-19 Immunity Task Force Data Access Committee. So he has basically a track record in immunological or clinical work. And he's going to actually talk to us about the open science as a strategic priority. And he's going to focus on public biological data sets that need to be publicly accessible. And however, they will need to be, so research groups or institutions and companies will have to balance the open sharing of data against competing interests, because of course this data is also IP and can be translated into commercial usage further on. So we are very much looking forward to your presentation, Alexander. And
well, thank you so much for having me. So today what I'll be talking about is the regulation of open science, and we're going to be looking mostly at data protection law and sort of contrasting it to the way that we think about open science, to the way we share data for open science purposes. The argument that's sort of, I guess, implicitly hidden in this presentation is that there seems to be a fundamental disconnect between the open science intentions that we embody in things like these UNESCO declarations and in our funding policies, and in the way we actually regulate how you can use data in terms of privacy legislation. So I'm not arguing that there's a tension between the idea of privacy and the idea of open sharing, but rather that the way we conceptualize open data sharing in public policy and the way we've legislated data protection law, privacy legislation, don't quite work. So in other words, that the solutions we have, the solutions that regulators are offering us, don't seem to interface very well with the ground reality of how we're already sharing data in health consortia. So what are we talking about here when we talk about open science? It gets conceptualized in a lot of ways by different authors, by different policymakers. But when we think specifically about data, we tend to think about a biomedical data commons. So this large body of health information that's available for downstream research use, but also for downstream clinical use. And, there's a number of specific things that go into having a biomedical data commons. We can talk about of course, things like access committees that regulate who can use the information, discovery tools, analysis tools, open software, and so forth. But I think really we can think of it in two main layers. We can think of it as technical infrastructure. So really everything from cloud computing platforms on through personnel who really simply develop software, provide data, curate data, so forth. And then secondly, an organizational structure. And that's really institutions and individuals' processes for determining who can access what kind of information, how the data should be generated, how it should be passed along to downstream users. This idea of a biomedical data commons has given way to a number of different biobanks and repositories that share data, aggregate data from individual studies into larger repositories, either at the level of a consortium where really a group of funders will come together and develop numerous studies for one shared purpose, or even for these much larger consortia. We can think of the International Cancer Genome Consortium as an example of that really pooled together data that weren't necessarily generated for the purpose of common use. So there you can think of organizations like the European Genomics Archive, the EGA, that really just bring together data from large numbers of different studies. And there, of course, some of the intent is to make this data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. But it's also to provide stable platforms so that many different consortia, many different researchers have a platform to turn to once they finish their localized individual studies. In the last few years, we've seen really a shift from this being an idea that's purely segregated to the realm of research to something that's increasingly integrated into clinical practice, and really an almost ambivalence to the distinction between data that's generated for strictly clinical purposes, data that's generated for research purposes, and data generated for a litany of other purposes, be they mobile health, be they personalized medicine, public health, or other. More or less, we're seeing a movement towards actualizing this idea of a learning health system. So really a health system that's responsive to individual traits and that integrates information about an individual from a number of different healthcare contexts, as it's generated, repurposing it to stratify care for that particular individual. So really to determine not only the health risk of a person relative to the medical condition that they might present, but really their health risk relative to their personal characteristics. And this isn't a new idea. So this idea of developing a learning health system, it's not something that's just cropped up lately. This actually goes back to research that was originally done in the 1980s by Charles Friedman and by a number of others. But the reason that it's come back into vogue lately is that the cost of generating information have decreased tremendously, and the access to infrastructure to actually share that information within the healthcare system is growing and growing. And when we think about infrastructure, we're not just talking about things like computers and cloud platforms. We mean professionals, individuals who consciously think about data sharing within the workflows that they operate on an everyday basis, and a growing pool of talent of really individuals that know how to analyze data, think about analyzing data, and are increasingly working in the healthcare sector. So this is something that's been ideated for a very long time, but we're seeing that the costs of actually implementing it are decreasing to the point where it's practicable from a technological, from an organizational standpoint. And when we think about personalized medicine, it's been conceptualized in all kinds of different ways, but I think really, at least for me, the main distinction between personalized medicine and not personalized medicine is that the healthcare intervention is tailored to characteristics that are intrinsic to the particular individual receiving the care, that don't necessarily have to do with purely their health status. So really moving from diagnosis being the main criterion for the choice of clinical intervention towards really characteristics about the individual receiving the care. And if we think about actual real world examples of personalized medicine, this can be everything from the incredibly simple, so for instance, clinical care guidelines that recommend screening and stratification of particular patients based on simple indicators of health risk. You might think of a classic example in breast cancer screening guidelines, onto the more sophisticated and technological. So there we can think of these newfangled algorithmic ways of sorting patients according to personalized health risk, be it through polygenic risk scores, be it through simple algorithms that try and generate an estimate of who is most at risk in terms of scheduling their care. So really how to sort of game the process of prioritizing some patients over others by just ingesting data about what kinds of therapies are better to prioritize and for whom. So I would describe that as the main paradigm shift. Now, here, in talking about open science and in talking about the clinical integration of open science, we've touched on a few themes, and really one of the big ones there is the transaction costs of repurposing information. So one of the reasons that this shift is happening is because information is incredibly costly to generate, but it's very cheap to reuse in other contexts, and also the contexts in which that information is going to be most useful aren't necessarily evident at the time that the information is first generated. Now, this clashes a little bit with the way we conceptualize data protection, data privacy law. So I'm going to take you through a short whirlwind tour of privacy legislation. Privacy legislation owes its origins to the 1980s as well. So what you see here on the screen are the OECD Fair Information Practices. And this is a constellation of principles that were first determined by the OECD to determine how each country should establish shared privacy norms. So in the 1980s, there was a lot of discussion because efforts to legislate privacy were cropping up in a number of different countries. You had some in US tort law, you had a few EU countries that were creating privacy laws, but you didn't have international global standards. And so a number of different countries came together and they came up with this. And the general idea was to give individuals rights to understand how their information was going to be used, so to be notified, to ask corporations to hold themselves accountable and even litigate if ever there was a breach of privacy. And then also a general principle of restricting information use to the purpose for which it was originally collected. So we talk about collection limitation, purpose specification, and use limitation, as well as data minimization as it's articulated today. And the basic idea there is generate information for a particular purpose, generate only what you need, and then don't use it again. At least not without additional justification or without the consent of the concerned individual. Now, one of the interesting things that we see here is that this clashes radically with the way we just spoke about open science. And in fact, there's an almost incommensurable rift between this idea of generating information and not reusing it on the one hand, or at least restricting its reuse, and the idea of reusing information as broadly as possible for a number of downstream purposes. So to bridge that gap, of course, a number of different countries, legislators, both in terms of hard law, so here we're public law, we're thinking really government implemented statutes, but also through less restrictive mechanisms, everything from the interpretive guidance of regulators on through contracts, IP law, have created specific rules that are meant to basically determine when information can be used on the one hand and when it shouldn't be used to respect privacy rights. And really, the general structure of those laws is to place an obligation on organizations that use information to justify their choices in using data, to justify their choices in using information. So these obligations to provide a justification really leave the onus on the organization using the data to draft a particular plan, a particular approach with regard to how they're going to use that information. And within any particular jurisdictional context, so at the national level or the subnational level, if you're thinking about states or provinces and such, this generally produces a coherent body of law where these national regulators will set out what you're allowed to do with information, and then will specify it in further and further detail through regulations and guidance and so forth. One of the major difficulties, however, is that once we get to the international stage, that there are so many different ways to conceptualize privacy, and that in fact there are so many different ways of specifying privacy requirements that actually it becomes difficult, if not impossible, to ensure compliance with all of them at the same time, or even to understand the full run of one's responsibilities. And so that leaves us in a position where this relatively technocratic, or at least relatively statute-driven way of understanding and specifying obligations in the use of information creates conflicts between this idea of broad transnational sharing, because every time you incorporate a new jurisdiction into a biobank, a consortium, and so forth, you need to grapple with a larger and larger number of statutes to a point which becomes so complex, and really we can think of that in a complex adaptive systems way of thinking about it, so complex to manage that it's beyond the capabilities of organizations. And what we see happen in practice is that these consortia actually remain siloed to specific jurisdictions. So more and more biobank studies get built out at the national level for reasons that are largely policy driven rather than scientifically driven. In the interest of time, I'll skip over a few of these slides, which really were sort of meant to trace an evolution in the way we conceptualize privacy. and really to show that the the way we legislate privacy has really shifted from a very restrictive individual right to control some information about themselves on towards a much more general concern with the way information is used worldwide. And not only worldwide, but in any context of downstream use, in recognition that because algorithms increasingly make decisions that affect one individual, but they're using information from a large number of different persons, it doesn't really make sense to conceptualize privacy as this restrictive individual right. In other words, the way that your neighbor's information is used could very truly determine your own outcomes. And so being concerned with your information alone doesn't really jive with the way that we conceptualize privacy today. It did in the 1960s and in the 1890s, when privacy was really concerned with these ideas of individual surveillance. But as we move towards a paradigm of really data governance, where we're going to reuse information about individuals to determine one person's outcomes relative to another's, the way we've historically conceptualized privacy doesn't make sense so much anymore. So before I dive into this section, I just wanted to ask when did we want to start that panel discussion? Because I'll speed up a little if we're short on time, but otherwise I'll run through a bit more. So yeah, how are we doing for time?
Probably we're gonna go through the presentations normal, and we're gonna cut a bit back on the panel discussion. But if you can speed it a little bit, that's very much appreciated. I wouldn't put you pressure on your own presentation.
No, that's okay. That's perfect. But no, I just wanted to make sure we still have time for the panel.
We'll do a 10 minutes, maybe shorter panel in case we don't make it. So, and we
Okay,
started
perfect.
it later, so we can take a couple minutes.
Perfect. Okay, well, thank you so much.
Okay.
All right, so we looked at those 1980s privacy principles to begin with. So one of the questions that we need to ask ourselves is really, how are they being implemented today, and what's changed since the 1980s? So really, in the 1980s, these fair information privacy principles started to be incorporated into national legislation. And there we can think of course, US law, where it's chiefly consumer privacy legislation that mandates corporations that basically self-select into a particular privacy policy to respect the commitments that they've made. So that was historically a very hands-off approach. Increasingly, though, we've said, as we discussed a little bit earlier, we've seen that legislation be much more formalized and become very rigid. So if we look at EU legislation, the first big privacy law that we saw was the 1995 Data Protection Directive, which was almost this sort of constitutional document giving every EU citizen rights to privacy and rights specifically to data protection, not only as individual privacy, but really as a right to investigate and to understand how their data was going to be used writ large. And this legislation was distinct from the principles in that it had a number of formal obligations that were directed to companies that used user information or individual information. So it had, of course, rights to be notified of the use of information, rights to object and to raise, basically other critiques of the use of one's information, as well as very specific security requirements. Now, this was framed as a directive, which is an EU law term that basically means that it's left to every singular state to implement the law in their own national legislation. There is no supranational EU level version of the law. In 2016, and it came into force in 2018, the Data Protection Directive was transformed into the General Data Protection Regulation, which wasn't actually so different in terms of its substantive content, but it had a lot more teeth simply because it was being applied at the level of the EU, and it invested supervisory authorities with very strong powers to enforce and to implement fines. It also placed heightened controls over data transfers. So data transfers were regulated at the EU level under the original Data Protection Directive. Essentially, the rule was that you needed an adequacy decision, which is basically a decision by the European Commission that sets out that you are allowed to transfer data to a particular country. So that is the European Commission, acting as a governmental body, would basically decide which countries had privacy legislation that was sufficiently similar to the European standard that they could receive data from the EU without additional safeguards. The idea there is we are granting EU citizens rights in their data. Data flows all around the world organically. If we don't grant these individuals guarantees that the data is going to be protected the same way when it reaches a different jurisdiction, these privacy safeguards will become functionally meaningless. And so there it would grant specific adequacy decisions to jurisdictions that respected similar privacy standards. If there wasn't an adequacy decision, and this remains true now under the GDPR, then another safeguard needed to be put into place. And there essentially the onus would shift to the person wanting to share data. And they would essentially receive the right to share that information, conditional on putting into place one of these additional safeguards. So there we traditionally think of standard contractual clauses, something that you integrate into a contract when you're sharing an individual's information that gives the recipient of that data the obligation to respect it, just the same way it would be in the EU. So now the interesting thing there is that that's, essentially a way of transnationalizing or, basically applying EU privacy standards outside of the EU. This is, essentially national regulators, and for very sound, policy reasons, wanting to spread their data protection standards into other jurisdictions. One of the big shifts, though, that we've seen since the original implementation of the Data Protection Directive under the GDPR is that the granting of adequacy decisions is becoming a lot more strict. So, without running too deeply into the minutiae, in granting inadequacy decisions, this used to be a fairly light touch review that has now become almost an obligation to adopt privacy standards that look almost like those in the EU, which means that countries that want to incorporate their own data protection laws are more and more baking in lots of EU or EU similar privacy standards, and not necessarily because this is the approach of best fit, but really because there are economic incentives to position themselves as a country as a potential recipient of an adequacy decision. So in requiring countries to adopt, EU-looking laws to benefit from adequacy, then the EU manages to transnationalize these standards. So that sort of leaves us in, and I'll skip through a little bit of the case law, a position where increasingly we're seeing the GDPR emerge as the best of fit privacy legislation because of the incentive structure that the law creates. So I'm going to take just another 3 minutes or so in the interest of time to run through a few conclusions. And so what we see here is really that there's increased incentive value to share information on the one hand, and on the other hand, there's a proliferation of similar but distinct privacy regimes and data protection regimes that frame privacies in ways that exist in difficult tension with open science. So from a practical standpoint, what can open science efforts do to share their data in the most cost-effective way under these existing regimes? And so here we're not trying to get into the discussion of, well, do we want to force these trade-offs into the law or not, which is I think a broader and interesting policy discussion. But really we're trying to see how can we share information under these existing paradigms? So the first approach is to render the information non-identifiable. General data protection legislation views identifiability as the determinative factor of whether the law will find application or not, which means that if the information isn't considered identifiable within the context of its use, it can generally be shared in a non-regulated way. And this is basically a risk-based framework wherein regulators and the regulated individuals will look at things that they've done to make the information less identifiable in order to mitigate that risk. So really we think about context of use, openness of release, and the incentives to attempt re-identification. So that's one of the approaches, which has, of course, received critique in and of itself because it forces trade-offs between keeping the data, highly rich and most useful on the one hand, and on the other hand, basically reducing its scientific value in order to comply with these with privacy standards. The other approaches are federated analysis, so really leaving the data in situ and analyzing it through these computational infrastructures, federated infrastructures that leave the data at rest and only share the results of statistical analysis or what have you with other with the other members of these sort of federated networks. The last approach, and really this one that I think has probably seen the most success, is to use organizational approaches to data governance. So really to obtain similar consents across all of the participating sites in different jurisdictions, and to really build on these organizational approaches to try and implement the same solutions across different jurisdictions. We can think of template-informed consent forms, shared data sharing agreements, contracts, expert governance bodies that will adopt across transnational lines to incorporate the same approaches to data governance in distinct jurisdictions for one common project. So I'll leave it at that for now, just to make sure that we leave time for the panel.
Thanks so much, actually, Alexander. That was great because you touched on some very interesting points. We will be very keen on deepening them in the panel discussion. So